Who's the best pick for turbo driver now that Charles and Sergio are both over 20 million? Is Max Verstappen about to start another mega streak of back-to-back victories, or will being crowned a two-time world champion be the catalyst for a downturn? And which of the backmarkers is going to put rubber on the road this weekend and bring home a fat stack of points? Stay tuned to find out, because we're going to answer all three of those questions in today's video using the latest driver viability matrix and the updated consistency rankings, because when it comes to driver selection, consistency is king. Play the intro. What is up, fantasy fans? Welcome back to The Data Straight, a channel here on YouTube dedicated to translating real-world data into actionable fantasy insight. Before we get into the video, I just want to remind everyone that I am not in any way affiliated with the Formula One brand or the company Play On that sponsors the game. I'm just an Excel nerd with a microphone and I love Formula One. Formula One is my passion, and I'm on a mission to build a community of hardcore fantasy fans here on YouTube. If that sounds like something you want to be a part of, stay tuned to the channel, and now we've got that out of the way, let's get into it. Let's start with the latest driver viability matrix, because that will enable us to focus the conversation in on the drivers that are worth considering. If we look at the chart, we can immediately see some of the opportunities to trim the fat from the 20 potential picks down to 14 viable picks. And I think we can also semi-confidently go from 14 to 12, assuming you agree with my analysis on two specific drivers' current trends. We'll get into the potentially controversial bits in a minute. First, let's start with the obvious ones. Yuki is still not a viable pick. After finishing P13 at Suzuka in both the race classification and the fantasy classification, Yuki has not done enough to lift himself off the bottom spot in the championship. So, even at his new bargain bin price point of just 4.5 million, Yuki is still a hard pass. Next up is Zhou, who is currently averaging 4.2 points per race, and at 5.6 million he is currently ranked 19th in the points per pound championship. So for me, that's a hard pass. Sadly, Daniel's P5 at Singapore is now looking like a bit of a fluke and not a momentous return to form, as the Honey Badger only managed to score 3 points at Suzuka, meaning that over the last 6 races, Daniel has only managed to score 14 points. The problem Daniel has, and I think the reason why only 13% of people have picked him at the time of recording this video, is that only 50% of his 6 most recent finishes are positive. The other 50% are of course negative, and that's not a risk I think you should be taking. Next up, it's Pierre, who is sadly also a pass. Pierre has not really been able to maintain his blistering pace from 2021 and 2022, but clearly his lack of results was not enough to put Alpine off of signing him, as we now have confirmation that Pierre will be joining Esteban at Alpine next year. I expect Pierre will become a staple in most people's teams in 2023. Perhaps he will prove himself to be the driver to have from the midfield picks, time will tell, but right here, right now, Pierre gets a soft pass. Moving up the curve, but sadly still flying underneath it, we have both Mercedes drivers. Now, both of these drivers are currently sitting on the top end of the consistency ratings, and they've both evidenced that they're capable of getting on the podium this year, so you'd think they'd be good picks. But the reason I'm passing on George and Lewis at this point in the season is while they're both capable of bagging some big points, neither of them is doing enough to justify their price tag. Yuki, Zhou, Daniel, Pierre, Lewis and George. We've very quickly reduced the pool from 20 down to 14. So, who are the two I'm eliminating based on the trends? Well, despite him securing his first points finish of the season, the first driver I'm eliminating from my selection is Latifi. And that's primarily because the data does not support picking Latifi for 5 million when you could have Mick for 0.8 or Kevin for just 1 million more. If you have the budget, you could spring the extra 1.9 million and get Latifi's teammate, who has outscored Latifi in 66% of the races so far this season, and then you'd be getting the 14th most cost-effective pick instead of the 17th most cost-effective pick. Now, the next driver I'm going to eliminate from my selection is one that causes me trouble week in, week out, and I think my position here might divide the crowd. But going into Kota, I'm going to eliminate Mick from selection. My reason is simple. Most teams need to run with 1 or 2 backmarkers to come in under budget. So, unless you're running with Max, Sergio and Red Bull, I don't think many people need to consider having a third backmarker in their teams. So let's assume that you just need 1 or 2 backmarkers to complete your lineup. Based on the data, Mick is the third best pick at this point in the season. Allow me to explain. In fantasy, I think you can break the drivers up into 4 tiers: God tier, top tier, midfielders and back markers. The only driver in the God tier this year is Max, but last year you'd have had Lewis in the mix as well. God tier drivers are drivers that you build your entire team around. Next we have top tier, and this year that's Charles, Sergio, George, Lewis and Carlos. You need to get 1, 2 or if you can 3 of these boys into your team, because these are the ones that bring home the big points most weekends. Then it's the midfield drivers, so that's P7 down to P12-ish. For a driver to be classified as a midfield driver, they need to be maintaining a double-digit average across the season. So, right now, that's Lando, Esteban, Fernando, Seb, Lance, and Valtteri. The back markers are then drivers that average single digits. So this year, that's Pierre, Alex, Kevin, Mick, Daniel, Latifi, Zhou, and Yuki. Back markers also tend to be the biggest risk because so far this season, 77% of the P20 classifications have been scored by those 8 drivers. It's also worth noting that 25% of these drivers' 136 separate scores are negative. So on average, 1 in 4 races, your back marker is going to steal points away from your team. If you have more than 1, that risk increases. With your back markers, you're mostly betting on if the driver will even finish the race, because if they finish, they'll get some points. There are standout performances like Kevin at Bahrain, where he scored 27 points, or Mick at Austria, where he scored 26 points. Or the biggest standout score this year goes to Yuki, who at the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix scored a massive 30 points. But really, as long as your back marker sees the checkered flag, you should be happy. Now, back to Mick. Why am I eliminating Mick? Well, if we exclude the drivers we've already eliminated, the back markers that are left are Alex, Kevin, and Mick in that order. Mick is 3rd in line based on his season-long performance because, although it's been very difficult to separate the Haas boys in recent weeks, coming out of Suzuka, Kevin has pulled far enough ahead that I feel comfortable saying that if I had to pick between Mick and Kevin, I would pick Kevin. If we jump into the teammate deltas for a second, we can see that after 18 races, we now have a gap of 15 points between the 2 Haas drivers. And that's the largest gap we've seen since the French GP, where Kevin led Mick by 18 points. I've actually spec'd up a quick visual to show you how their points have stacked up across the season. And what we can see here is Kevin came out of the gates steaming, and then he stumbled and he got kind of stuck in a bit of a tailspin here, while Mick continued in his lane, slowly but surely catching up. Then Mick went on a dynamite run of form in the middle of the season, where he really took the fight to Kevin, and for weeks now it's pretty much been a slogfest back and forth between these two. As I said, coming out of Suzuka, Kevin has now opened up a small gap, and I feel like the momentum has swung to favour Kevin again. For me, the data is suggesting that Kevin is setting himself up to end the season how he started it. So, going into Kota, I'm going to say that Kevin has the edge. And I want to pause here and answer one of the questions I posed at the top of the video. Which of the back markers is going to put rubber on the road this weekend and bring home a fat stack of points? The data suggests that the back marker to have is Alex. Then, if you need a second back marker, your second pick should be Kevin. As I said earlier, I don't think many people actually need a third back marker, but if you do need a third, now is when you should look towards young Mickey Shue. Okay, so we're about 8 minutes into the video, so let's jump into the website so I can walk you through my lineup. Straight off the bat, Red Bull are staying put as my constructor, and I'll just take 30 seconds to explain why, then we'll get back into the drivers. Red Bull have been on the podium in all but one race so far this year, and they're currently on their second 5-race win streak of the season. If the pattern is going to repeat, then we should actually only expect to see a podium, not a win this weekend. But I think Red Bull are going for win number 6 this weekend, and that's why I'm going to stick with a team who are currently top of the Fantasy Championship, 265 points ahead of their nearest rivals, and just hope that despite all the negative press the Bulls are getting this weekend, that they do what they've been doing all season long, and that's score a big stack of points. Just a quick bonus point, if I wasn't picking Red Bull, I would of course be looking at Ferrari, but for me, their consistency is a concern. However, as I said in my last video, if I wanted to carry some extra budget into the drivers market, I would actually be looking towards Aston Martin, who are currently P3 in the points per pound championship. Okay, so Red Bull are staying put, and for me, that basically eliminates Max, because if I went with Max and Red Bull, that's 70.7 million of my budget blown on 2 picks. So, on my front row, I have Charles, Sergio and Esteban, with Esteban as my turbo driver. Now, that was a solid pick for Suzuka because although some people managed to keep Sergio as their turbo driver, I was unable to pick Sergio, and if we look at the race classification, you'll see that Esteban finished P4 and scored a very decent 29 points. So that was literally the next best choice out of the 15 eligible options. Now, what does that mean for Kota? Let's take a second to step back and talk about turbo drivers. Who is still eligible to be your turbo driver at this point in the season? Based on the data, the only 4 worth considering are Carlos, Lando, Esteban and Fernando, and that's the order they're currently sitting in the fantasy classification. Looking at their averages, Carlos is scoring 22.9 points per race, Lando is clocking 17.6 points per race, and then Esteban is averaging 14.3 and Fernando is averaging 12.9. So based on the averages, Carlos is the clear winner. Carlos is also the only driver of the four to have won a race this year, and he has the most podiums. Fernando and Lando both have 2 podiums, and Esteban has yet to score a podium. Plus, Esteban has the lowest high, and he is the only driver to have finished dead last. So at this point, we'd probably say it's Carlos, Lando, Fernando, then Esteban. If we jump into the consistency rankings for one final sense check, we see that Carlos and Fernando are actually the least consistent of the 4 drivers. And this view suggests that Lando is the clear pick. If we try bringing this to life with a little visual, it looks something like this. Here, we're awarding 1 to 4 points in each of the 3 categories, with the aim being to have the lowest overall score across the 3 rankings. As you can see, we have a tie between Carlos and Lando. So, circling back once again to the top of the video, question was, who's the best pick for Turbo Driver this weekend now that Charles and Sergio are both over 20 million? The answer, according to the data, is either Carlos or Lando, depending on your budget. If you can afford Carlos and you don't mind the concentration risk, assuming you already have Charles in your team, then go with Carlos. If you want to diversify your lineup or you just don't have the budget for Carlos, then go with Lando. For Kota, I'm going with Lando because he is on a race streak, so that's worth an extra 10 points straight out the gate. Now, because I'm sticking with Charles and Sergio, that means I can't afford to run with Lance, which is a real shame in my mind because Lance has been a staple in my team for most of the season, and it pains me to sell him off like this. But it actually falls perfectly for me because if I sell Lance, I am left with 6.9 million, which is exactly how much I need to get the already established king of the backmarkers into my team. Goodbye Lance, hello Alex. Okay, so that's my final lineup. Going into this weekend, I'm targeting 169 points, and that's 35.2 points from Lando, 17.6 times 2, because he's going to be my turbo driver. 29.8 from Charles, 28.2 from Sergio, 7.5 from Alex, and 7.3 from Kevin. So that's 108 from my drivers, and then I'm expecting to see 61.8 from my constructor. So that's 169 total. Last week I scored 224 off a target of 179, so I exceeded my target by 25%. If I can exceed my target by 25% again this week, I'll be very pleased because I think that will almost certainly mean I finish P1 in my league. Looking at my team, I'm very happy with the balance. I'm not concerned about the complete lack of Mercedes. I am a little bit worried about the lack of Alpine, but we ran the numbers and that's what the data tells us is the right thing to do, so I'm going to go with it. In closing, for me, the thing I think people need to get right this weekend is their turbo driver. I've shown you what I think is the right thing to do. If you disagree, please let me know who you're backing and why down in the comments. If you're still with us, thanks for watching to the end. I wish you all the best with your team selection. Hope you have a great day ahead and I'll see you again very soon.